So, anything exactly this word? There we go. There it goes. Good shot of heads there. All right, get out in front here. So again, thank you everyone for having me today. I am one of the interpretive rangers at Monocacy National Battlefield, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with you all. And as was said, we're going to be covering Held Bridge to the Last, the Baltimore Ohio Railroad and the Battle of Monocacy. Now, first off, before we jump in, has everybody here visited Monocacy National Battlefield before? Okay, a lot of hands, a few shaking heads though. I do encourage you guys to come out and visit us. The National Battlefield is open 5 days a week currently. We're trying to get up to 7 in the summers when we have a little bit more staff, but we're currently open from Thursday to Monday. And our museum space, to kind of interest you guys to come on back and see us again, for those of you who have visited before, our museum is undergoing restoration, or excuse me, a complete renovation, and will be reopened to the public with brand new exhibits come this spring, hopefully the end of April, early May. So another reason to come back, and for those of you who haven't visited us in our 1,650-ish acres of preserved battlefield landscape, another reason to come join us.
Where is it? Your hiking trails?
Yes, we've got almost 15 miles of hiking trails on the battlefield as well. Some really good hiking and natural landscape opportunities too. It's not just all shooting, I promise.
Where is it?
Just south of Frederick, Maryland, on Route 355, actually between Urbana and Frederick.
Oh, okay.
Now, basically, as you're hitting Frederick, you're passing right through the battlefield. But good questions. Where the place is always a good one. Yes, ma'am.
Is the Antietam Visitor Center reopened yet?
Antietam Visitor Center reopened last summer. It is still having some teething issues. A lot of the artifacts are currently off display because of some water issues that they're having, but the museum itself is open, and they also have their brand new film playing as well in the theater. You might notice a few folks in there. But let's jump into our program this evening. First and foremost, I know you guys are probably very knowledgeable on the Baltimore Ohio Railroad, but I did want to hit a few of the highlights about it, just in case we had folks who are not familiar with it. So first off, of course, we have John Works Garrett, president of the B&O Railroad during the Civil War. He's born in 1820 to a banking family, and he is going to attend Lafayette College. He would join his father in the banking industry and then becomes a member of the Baltimore Ohio Railroad Board in 1855. Now, he's actually going to be elected president of the board in 58. So he's going to be taking on this railroad just before the Civil War. Obviously, nobody realized that the war was right on top of him at that point, but he is going to be the figurehead, not just the figurehead, the driving force for the railroad throughout the entire conflict. The railroad itself, of course, is chartered in 1827 and begins construction in 1828. This is an artistic license, kind of a fancy painting of the laying of the first stone. It's the keystone for the B&O Railroad. And by May of 1830, the first 13 miles of the railroad had been established. And of course, by this point, it is just being pulled along, really, by horses. Primarily. It would reach the Ohio River, though, by 1852 on Christmas Eve. That's, of course, an image of, my laser's not working on here very well, but image of going over the river. And by 1861, at the beginning of the American Civil War, the Baltimore Ohio Railroad consists of 236 locomotives. So wartime image, restored engine, I should say. 128 passenger cars. This is actually a United States military railroad car, but they would have looked much like that. 3,451 freight cars and coal cars. These images courtesy of the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore. And 513 miles of track stretching from Baltimore all the way across to the Ohio River. It's a big railroad, and most of it Virginia and what becomes West Virginia. So, there could be a problem there already. Now, the Baltimore Ohio Railroad has a big role to play at my site, at Monocacy, but it is going to be involved in the American Civil War from the very beginning. Of course, the railroad bridge at Harper's Ferry is destroyed in 1861. They have to begin to develop ways to get around that. They're actually going to build a pontoon bridge and utilize moving goods across the river by wagon and then loading them onto additional trains and pushing on from there. But in 1862, we would have the Maryland campaign. This is where I started my Park Service career with the Antietam National Battlefield. Maryland campaign ran from September 4th to September 20th of 1862. There were numerous reasons why Confederate forces crossed the Potomac River. They've had a series of victories in the summer of 1862. And Lee wants to keep that pressure on. He is also looking at political opportunities. He's looking at the ability to reinforce his army and to feed his army, and primarily, he is looking for a fight. He wants to draw federal forces out of the defenses of Washington, D.C. and beat them somewhere on their own soil, somewhere in Maryland, perhaps even in Pennsylvania. So he is looking for that battle. And with Confederate forces in Maryland, while the Confederate Army is supposedly trying to behave itself, it is going to strike at federal infrastructure, including breaking the C&O Canal on September 4th, and of course, on September 8th, when they reach the outskirts of Frederick, Maryland, they are going to strike at the Baltimore Ohio Railroad itself. We can see the railroad bridge at Monocacy Junction destroyed here. This is the covered bridge that goes over at basically where 355 is today. And this is another image of the destruction of the railroad bridge. This is a big deal. In fact, it's such a big deal that this sort of damage is going to be remarked on in the annual reports of the Baltimore Ohio Railroad. In fact, this quote comes from the 1862 report, "The splendid iron suspension bridge at Monocacy, blown up by the enemy. The bridge consisted of 3 spans of 115 feet each. The water station at Monocacy, including the pump house and engine, also burned." So significant damage to the infrastructure around Monocacy Junction. And this is really where we're going to focus our talk for much of the night, is right around the junction itself and the bridge. Now, there would be a trestle that replaces that bridge, and we have trains up and running by 11 a.m. on September 21st, 1862. So we're going to blow it up on the 8th, up and running by the 21st. Wow, pretty good. Pretty good. And it's only going to get better. The Baltimore Ohio Railroad gets extremely good at repairing itself over the course of the war. But with this destruction, it's decided that there needs to be some sort of defense for the bridge, for the junction. And so we're going to bring in the Monocacy Regiment, the 14th New Jersey Infantry. Brand new regiment. It's got just about 950 men with it when it marches to Monocacy Junction, or I should say is shipped to Monocacy Junction, arriving on September 3rd, 1862. Confederate forces show up on September 6th. Went the wrong way. So they're going to leave on September 4th, as word is reaching them and the people of Frederick that Confederate forces have moved over the Potomac River and are pushing towards Frederick City. The 14th New Jersey evacuates, falls back, and would return to Monocacy Junction on September 17th, the very day of the Battle of Antietam. So where they went in between, they actually came out here. They came out towards Ellicott City. They went down the railroad tracks about 30 miles or so. They guarded other points along the B&O Railroad, and then they were ordered back to the junction when the threat of Lee's army had passed. And they're going to remain at Monocacy Junction for about 9 months. This is why they become known as the Monocacy Regiment, because they have such deep ties to the community. They would actually spend the entire winter of 62 into 63 at Monocacy Junction, at what was known as Camp Hooker. not too far off of the federally protected grounds of Monocacy National Battlefield today. Of course, that is named after Joseph Hooker, the Union general, not anything else. These troops are going to actually build the defenses that we would have around Monocacy Junction, including 2 blockhouses. Little wooden forts. One that sat on one side of the river, close to Frederick, or closer to Frederick. The other on the opposite side of the river, basically on both ends of the bridge, of the Iron Railroad Bridge. These little wooden forts were supposed to be strong points. And you can see the loopholes in them here, these little slats for musketry and whatnot. They could hold a bunch of guys. They also built trenches. They're going to dig in around Monocacy Junction, specifically the high ground that is south of the Monocacy River. So 355 runs right up into Frederick. South of the Monocacy River, there's all sorts of high ground there. They're going to dig all sorts of trenches and rifle pits in that high ground, the remains of which some still exist to this day. Now, not everybody, in fact most troops at this time, especially new troops, do not like the idea of digging in. And we do have an account of one of the 14th New Jersey when this order gets passed down. He's writing a letter home at the time. "I must close this. The order is to dig trenches. I'm going to sneak out of it if I can. Good many of our boys are taken suddenly sick." This comes from Jacob Walcott of the 14th New Jersey Infantry. Not too long after they've reached Monocacy Junction, September 28th, 1862. So, with this defense that's being built up around Monocacy Junction, built up around the railroad bridge and the road bridge, we're going to see the 14th New Jersey remain at the junction until July 6th of 1863. Of course, what's been raging to the north of Maryland? Battle of Gettysburg. Largest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. The 14th New Jersey has been moved around quite a bit from the end of June to July 6th. They actually went down to Harper's Ferry very briefly. They helped evacuate the stores of Harper's Ferry, returned to Monocacy Junction, and then were attached to the Army of the Potomac as part of the 3rd Corps. So they're going to march away, but we'll see them again. They're going to march away in part because other troops are coming up to guard this junction, to guard the railroad. The 7th New York State Militia, one of the finest militia regiments in the pre-war Army of the United States, is now on hand to guard this junction. And over the course of the whole Civil War, we would see over a dozen different regiments guarding the Baltimore Ohio Railroad, and specifically the bridge at Monocacy Junction, over the course of the 4 years of war, including hometown units such as the 2nd and 3rd Maryland Potomac Home Brigade, our neighbors to the north in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Illinois, and even New York. And there's a Maine unit there too, so a whole spread of the Federal Army is going to be passing through this small point, and many of those troops from the Army of the Potomac and other commands would be left behind to guard this important resource. Now, the 3rd Confederate invasion of the North, or 3rd Confederate invasion of Maryland, occurs in the summer of 1864, the last full year of the war. On June 12, 1864, Robert E. Lee is going to call upon Jubal Early, Lieutenant General Jubal Early, commander of the Confederate 2nd Corps, to begin moving his forces into the Shenandoah Valley to aid Lynchburg. How many of you folks are familiar with Lynchburg, Virginia? A few, okay. So, what does Lynchburg have during the Civil War that is extremely important for Robert E. Lee? What's important about Ellicott City and where we're at right now? The railroad, exactly. It's a railroad crossroads. In fact, almost all the grain and hoof stock of the Shenandoah Valley is passing through Lynchburg on its way east to Petersburg and the defenses of Richmond. United States forces are in the Shenandoah Valley in the spring and early summer of 1864. Ulysses S. Grant has unleashed offensives across the board. And one of his forces, David Hunter, is in the valley, tearing up telegraph lines, tearing up the railroad. He is moving on Lynchburg to shut down this important supply route that is literally helping to feed Lee's forces. And while Robert E. Lee is loath to break off a big chunk of his army, he's going to be basically forced to do it. And he would send Jubal Early out to Lynchburg, Virginia, to aid the former Vice President of the United States, John Breckinridge there, who is the Confederate commander at Lynchburg, aid in the defense of that important railroad crossroads. Now, they're going to reach Lynchburg a little before June 18th. In fact, it's a couple of days. The fighting is actually on June 18th. What's going to happen is that the Confederate commanders are going to trick their Federal opponent. David Hunter, this gentleman, has in the neighborhood of 16,000 men. The Confederate garrison, with the addition of Early's forces, probably in the 14,000 range. So outnumbered, but not badly. But Jubal Early has decided to trick David Hunter. The last leg of his trip to Lynchburg was done by train. Brought the train into town, troops get off, the whistles blow, the bands play, the people cheer, and that train leaves. Then Jubal Early brings it back into town, and he sends it away again. And he brings it back into town, and he sends it away again. And every time it comes into the city, the whistles blow, the bands play, the people cheer. There's not more troops getting off that train, but what does it sound like to Federal forces outside of the city? Reinforcements, and lots of them. And because of that, David Hunter is going to begin to fall back. We're actually going to see a running series of engagements in the lower part of the Shenandoah Valley from June 19th to the 21st. By June 21st, he is actually going to be, or I should say his rear guard is defeated at the Battle of Hanging Rock, and he withdraws entirely from the Shenandoah Valley, falling back into West Virginia on his way to the Ohio River. Pulls himself entirely out of the campaign. Jubal Early has been told that if he can clear the valley, he should then proceed north. What was known as going down the valley, strike at the Potomac, cross it, and threaten Washington, D.C. from the north. So that's exactly what he's going to do. On June 22nd, he's going to begin to move northward, reorganizing his army at Stanton on the 26th, and continues to push on towards Harper's Ferry. This is on foot. He's going to go from June 22nd to Winchester, July 2nd, 175 miles, 10 days. 2 days after that, he's at Harper's Ferry. Of course, that means he's at Harper's Ferry on July 4th, Independence Day. The Federal garrison at Harper's Ferry had not been preparing for a battle. They'd been preparing for a party. It's the national holiday. There's food available, there's drink available. They were going to have a good time. But with the approach of Confederate forces, the garrison of Harper's Ferry is going to fall back to the heights above, specifically these forts up here on Maryland Heights and Fort Duncan. How many of you folks have visited Harper's Ferry? Pretty much everybody. Fantastic. So Harper's Ferry in 1862, 2 years before this, was the site of the largest surrender of United States forces until the Second World War. We have just about 13,000 men captured at Harper's Ferry. It's a huge blow to the Federal war effort. And Jubal Early, if he could replicate this, what his predecessor had done, he absolutely would have done so. But with his approach, with his taking a lot of the same ground that had been taken in 1862 outside Harper's Ferry, the garrison is not going to make the same mistake. In 62, they tried to defend the town, which is at the bottom of a bowl, as you guys know. But in 64, they have since fortified all the heights around it. And so they're going to fall back into those fortifications and basically tell Jubal Early to come get some. Well, Early is going to glare at those forts, and the forts are going to glare back at him for about a day. And while this is happening, we would see artillery fire traded between the two sides, but Confederate forces actually get into Harper's Ferry, and they get into the warehouses, and the depots, and they get into that food that's been left behind, and they have themselves a pretty good time. But Jubal Early can't wait around. He actually wrote in his memoirs after the war that he felt he could have taken Harper's Ferry if he had more time to do it. But he needs to keep pressing on if he wants to threaten Washington, D.C. So instead, he's going to shift just a little bit further north, about 10 miles to Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and cross over the Potomac on the night of July 5th into the 6th of 1864. Now, the presence of Confederate forces in the Shenandoah Valley, particularly the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley, has not gone unnoticed. At the same time that Early has been mucking around Harper's Ferry, his cavalry has been tearing up the B&O Railroad off to the northwest of Harper's Ferry. And the telegraph operators in the northern part of the valley have been reporting on this. Telegraph operators on the B&O began to report 15 to 30,000 Confederates moving through the Shenandoah Valley as early as June 29th. So these reports, they are going to Baltimore. They're going to John Garrett, who is then forwarding this information to the War Department. How do you think the War Department responds to this initial call for aid and this initial alarm? That's about it right there. They basically ignore them. They didn't think it was possible that that many men, and yes, the numbers are a little inflated, they are civilian operators after all, but they didn't think it was possible that that many Confederates were loose in the Shenandoah Valley and nobody was trying to stop them. That David Hunter wasn't dealing with them, that it wasn't possible that that size of force could actually be there. It must be civilians panicking over a cavalry raid or something like that. And so initially they do ignore these calls for aid. This would be one of the messages that John Garrett sends to Washington. I find from various quarters statements of large forces in the valley. I am satisfied the operations and designs of the enemy in the valley demand the greatest vigilance and attention. Vigilance and attention that is not being had. On July 2nd and 3rd of 1864, Major General Franz Sigel is going to begin the evacuation of Martinsburg, West Virginia. This is a big depot for the B&O. 150 rail cars would evacuate the government stores from Martinsburg, West Virginia. And elements of Early's army, specifically elements of Gordon's division, would begin to arrive later on the 3rd of July. And they're going to destroy the depot. There's going to be significant damage done to the B&O holdings off to the west. With this destruction, with this movement of equipment and materials, yet again, John Garrett would try to get some action happening from Washington, from the War Department. I apprehend the information recently sent you of heavy forces in the valley is about to prove correct. Bit of a I told you so from Garrett to General Hancock, who's the Chief of Staff of the Federal Army at the time in Washington. Henry Halleck, excuse me. But where does this leave Monocacy? Well, because of the need to defend the Junction and the railroad bridge, John Wilkes Garrett is going to turn to the federal commander that is right next to him. So he's based out of Baltimore. So is Lew Wallace. General Lew Wallace is the commander of the Middle Department, where the 8th Union Corps is based out of Baltimore, and he agrees to send troops to Monocacy Junction as early as July 3rd. Now he's going to call upon the commander of his 1st Separate Brigade, Brigadier General Erastus Tyler, who would bring the 1st Separate Brigade out to Monocacy Junction. They're part of the 8th Corps. Most of this command is made up of 100 days men, which means that's their entire term of service, 100 days. But he does have 2 regiments that have seen some action before. He's got the 1st and the 3rd Maryland Potomac Home Brigade. They have not seen action, though, in at least a year by this point. So he doesn't have real frontline troops with him. Wallace himself would decide to concentrate the majority of his forces at Monocacy Junction. I keep trying to use the laser. at Monocacy Junction on July 6th. He is going to have approximately 3,300 men when his whole command gets there. And again, most of those guys are very limited experience, or have very limited experience. 8th Corps is going to go into position around Monocacy Junction, utilizing the blockhouses and that high ground we already talked about. These positions here actually do have some earthworks. They do have some entrenchments that have been built previously, and they're going to expand on those a little bit. Now, up until this point, Ulysses S. Grant, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, the General-in-Chief of all federal forces, has believed that the Confederate Army in its entirety is in front of him at Richmond and Petersburg. But by July 5th, there's been enough information coming from John Garrett, coming from Garrett's telegraph operators, and now some of the military resources north around Washington and Harper's Ferry, that Grant has been convinced something's going on above the Potomac. And he is going to react to the threat. On July 5th, he would send the 6th Corps, the Greek Cross, north from the Petersburg front. Specifically on July 6th, the 3rd Division, 6th Corps, would board vessels down here at City Point and begin the trip down the James River, around the bend here at Fortress Monroe, and all the way up to Baltimore. 250 miles by water. They're going to do it in just less than 48 hours, so they're moving pretty good. They would arrive at Locust Point in Baltimore. Heard some folks react to that. But Locust Point is where all the shipping is coming into Baltimore at this time, and where the B&O Railroad has a railhead. And again, John Garrett is going to work very hard to move forces from this point. The 3rd Division began arriving late on July 7th, and by 12:50 a.m., the first trains were on their way to Monocacy Junction. This is one of the communications. I've noticed several nice exhibits here in the museum talking about the communications by telegraph that Wallace and Garrett are utilizing. Let's see, for this one in particular, there we are. Transportation has been sent to Locust Point, and I have detailed our most effective officers to hasten the disembarkation of troops and to urge their loading and forwarding with the greatest practical dispatch. So Garrett, the civilian, is doing all he can to aid the war effort here, because, let's be honest, he wants to defend his bridge. Additional trains, as the rest of the 3rd Division is coming in, are going to be leaving Locust Point starting on July 8th at 3:20 a.m., 4 a.m., 7:45, 8:30, 9:40, 12 p.m., and 4 p.m. The last troops are finally on their way towards Monocacy Junction. Now, you'll notice 2 special trains in there. That's mostly ammunition, food, things like that. How is this sort of coordination possible? Primarily, it's because of John Garrett and his brilliant master of transportation, William Prescott Smith. And I love that title. If you're going to have a title, that's the title to have, the master of transportation. But Smith, he is actually in these dispatches that we have from the American Civil War, from the Monocacy campaign, quite a bit as well, because he's moving pieces around. He's working with Garrett. He's working with these telegraph operators and the folks along the B&O line to make sure trains are available or out of the way. That's another big one. Make sure the track is clear. The 3rd Division, 6th Corps was transferred to Wallace at Monocacy Junction, and it's commanded by Brigadier General James Ricketts. His forces are going to arrive with about 3,500 men from Locust Point in less than 24 hours. So we now have 6,600 federal troops and 7 cannon versus 12 to 15,000 Confederate troops and 38 cannon. The Battle of Monocacy is a one-day engagement fought on July 9th, 1864. There has been some preliminary fighting west of town on the 7th and 8th of July. that helped kind of ascertain what was really coming at Wallace, but the main engagement is on July 9th. This battle will succeed in delaying the Confederate advance on Washington, D.C. by 24 hours, allowing the defenses of Washington to be reinforced. Remember, Washington, D.C. in 1864 is the most heavily fortified city on earth. There are 63 forts surrounding the national capital and 98 batteries or gun positions. Thousands of men should be holding those fortifications, but many of those northern forts have actually had their troops removed from them to aid the field armies. And so the northern ring of forts is actually very poorly manned when Confederate forces are going to be moving towards them. So the crucial delay that is fought here at Monocacy will allow time for the rest of the Union 6th Corps, the 19th Corps, and the veteran reserves to pour into those fortifications and secure the national capital. It's more than just transportation, though. It's more than just the fact that he's moving trains around. Garrett is also providing crucial intelligence throughout this campaign to the Lincoln administration, because it is the civilian telegraph network that is being utilized and disrupted by the advancing Confederates. In fact, this message here is actually in one of your exhibits just in the other room, where Garrett's responding to Stanton and Washington about what has happened at the battle. Talking about how close additional troops were getting to Monocacy Junction, the very last troops of the 3rd Division that never quite get there. How close they were when they begin to hear word of the defeat. And they decided to hold there at the, he says the 4th Plain, so not far from, what is that? Say that again?
Mount Airy.
Thank you, that's exactly what I was trying to think of. Not far from Mount Airy at all. Now, Wallace is going to fall back along the Baltimore Pike to Ridgeville and would be able to regain contact with the War Department by way of the Baltimore Ohio Railroad telegraph. I did as I promised, held the bridge to the last. They overwhelmed me with numbers. My troops fought splendidly. Losses fearful. Send me cars enough to Ellicott Mills to take up my returning columns. Don't fail me. Lew Wallace didn't have to add that "don't fail me" on the end there, because John Wilkes Garrett has not failed him once during this campaign, and he would continue to not fail him as Federal forces, exhausted from the fighting at Monocacy, do stay the night at Ridgeville. They continue to press on July 10th to Ellicott Mills, what is today Ellicott City, to this very structure where they would actually re-embark on the cars, on the rail cars, and head back to Baltimore. Of course, one of the images, not quite wartime, but very close to it, images of the railroad station here. That same day, July 10th, we would have Major General John Brown Gordon burn the B&O resources at Monocacy Junction. Wipes them out. Just the station master's house, the small little hotel that was there, the coaling station, the water tower, all of it gone. And they would attempt to destroy the bridge. They're actually going to point blank it with a cannon at one point. They do damage it, but they can't destroy it. It's just too big, and they don't have the time because they're trying to press on towards Washington. Baltimore Ohio Railroad traffic fully resumed on July 21st, 1864. But the bridge itself is not reached by the B&O Railroad Company to repair it until 3 days after Confederates have moved off from the area. So we're talking about July 13th. They're going to repair the bridge by the 15th, and the whole track out to Harper's Ferry and beyond is repaired and operational by July 21st. This is how good the B&O has gotten in repairing itself, moving down the track with its supplies, stopping at breaks, repairing them, and pushing on. But thank you very much for having me this evening to speak on this topic. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have on the Baltimore Ohio Railroad and its connections to Monocacy Junction and the Battle of Monocacy. But thank you. Yes, sir.
Didn't Early take his cavalry all the way to Washington, to the borders of Washington, and leave his army back?
So that's a great question. So what's happening there is, and I didn't bring it up in this talk because it could be its own separate talk, is the Johnson-Gilmore raid, okay? The bulk of Early's cavalry on the day of the Battle of Monocacy bug out. They move well north of Frederick and cross the Monocacy River to the northeast of where the battle's actually going on. They're on their own raid, they have their own mission, and they're going to do some significant damage to railroads, to depots, all along their route of advance. In fact, they will destroy a train and the bridge over the Gunpowder River. That's how close they're going to get to Baltimore. Harry Gilmore, a native of Baltimore, is supposedly going to sneak into the city and have dinner with his parents, and then come back to his men before this raid is over. What's interesting about that is that the focus of the Johnson-Gilmore raid is to not only cause a ruckus around Baltimore, but they're actually supposed to go all the way down to Point Lookout and the Confederate POW camp that's way out there at the edge of Maryland in hopes of freeing those Confederate prisoners. Now, it's a fool's errand. Even Early recognizes that when he tells the Bradley Johnson, who's not only in charge of this raid, who's also from Frederick, interestingly enough, that you're going to go try to do this. Johnson says it can't be done. There's not enough time. And Early essentially tells him, I know, but we've been ordered to give it a shot. And so the majority of the Confederate cavalry is moving far and away from the rest of Early's command. And Early himself would move with his infantry, a smidgen of his cavalry, and the rest of his forces down to Washington, D.C., and engage the defenses of Washington on July 11th and 12th. But a great question. Yes.
The workforce that was so efficient in doing these repairs, like, who was that work? You know, what people were in that workforce? Where were we getting these?
Right, that's actually a really interesting question because, and we touch on it a little bit with some of the exhibits in here, the diverse workforce of the Baltimore Ohio Railroad. Those workers are going to be a wide spread of the diaspora of the country at the time. We've got a lot of immigrant workers. We don't have too many enslaved workers going on with the B&O at this point, in large part because the state is rapidly moving away from slavery. In the spring of 1864, there has been a state constitutional convention that has elected representatives to basically form a new state constitution. And they're having those debates in the summer of '64 when the raid is going on, when this incursion into Maryland is going on. And on October 12th and 13th of 1864, the people of Maryland, the voting population of Maryland, I should say, will then vote for a new state constitution. It barely passes, but it does pass, making slavery illegal in the state. So while you guys know the emancipation has been in effect for a year at this point, it didn't affect the border states. It didn't affect Maryland directly. And so the state of Maryland itself will vote to end slavery within its borders. And that's going to go into effect on November 1st, 1864. So the state is rapidly moving away from using enslaved labor, and so we didn't have a lot of enslaved individuals working along the B&O's tracks at that time. It would have been more immigrant labor and manual labor from folk.
Yes. How long did it take by train from Baltimore to Monocacy Junction?
That's actually a really interesting question. Now, it's going to take the federal troops to get there less than 24 hours. We see Wallace's men, Wallace himself and Erastus Tyler, again, taking about 12 hours or so. Okay? How that works for regular riders like you and I'm not certain, to be perfectly honest. I'm not certain what the transit time would be. Actually, can either of you guys answer that question?
I'd have to double check the timetables, but it would be like 3 hours, depending on where you're stopping along. Between Baltimore and Frederick in the 1860s, it'd be around 2 hours depending on stops.
Really? That quickly?
Yeah.
Not bad at all.
Yeah.
That's basically the commuter train today.
Effectively, you were going faster speeds then than you were on trains. So,
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I wonder how that would have worked with the trains moving the opposite direction and having to do the pull-offs and things like that. But regardless, that's really interesting. I didn't realize they were moving that quickly.
Yeah, I got to double check the timetables, that's around that time, so yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Which brings up another question. How much of the track was double track between here and there?
So that's interesting because today, the track over the Monocacy River is a single track. It's got a big deck on the bridge, but it was double tracked during the American Civil War. In fact, Monocacy Junction was double tracked except for the Frederick Spur. That might not have been double tracked at the time, but the main line was. It was a double track line. And I'm pretty sure it's the whole way too.
Yeah, it was the first double track line in the United States.
Thank you. Additional questions?
If any about this particular site, we also have the museum manager next, so he can probably answer some of them.
You guys are going easy on me tonight, but I thank you very much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.